So the Amazon has been always called the lungs of the earth. And it is true because in the way that the Amazon absorbs CO2, the trees absorb CO2 and breathe out oxygen. So that's kind of like our own lungs. But more and more indigenous peoples always said the Amazon is the heart of the planet, heart of the Mother Earth. And now through meteorological and scientific analysis, we're basically concurring that the Amazon basically operates as the heart of the hydrological climatic system of the biosphere. It is actually big enough to be an entity, an organ in the biosphere. So it's both the heart and the lungs of the biosphere.
Welcome to the Regeneration Will Be Funded. My name is Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're exploring the intersections of regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. Created with Ma Earth, you can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Today's guest is Atossa Soltani. Atossa has devoted over 25 years to the protection of the Amazon rainforest. She was the founder and executive director of Amazon Watch and currently serves as the board's president. She's also the director of global strategy at the Amazon Sacred Headwaters initiative. In this discussion, we talk about Atossa's journey to the jungle. We go into the development of a cutting-edge Bioregional plan, which aims to protect over 30 million hectares of Amazonian rainforest, and how this plan was developed in partnership with indigenous communities around their life plans process. This is a fascinating concept that I think we can all learn from. Atossa shares with us why the Amazon is so important, how this is not only the lungs of the planet, but really the heart of the planet. And we get into the funding conversation. What's needed, important considerations, carbon markets, biodiversity credits, rights of nature, international agreements, and more. This is a really great educational conversation about the Amazon rainforest. It was recorded at the Eco Weaving Gathering in Wilbur, California in May 2023. Let's get into it. Atossa Soltani. We're here with Atossa Soltani. Atossa is the global coordinator for Amazon Sacred Headwaters initiative. She is the founder and president of Amazon Watch, a longtime forest activist, and we're just really appreciative for your time and for doing this.
Thank you, Matthew, for having me.
And thank you so much for taking me down to the Amazon for my very first trip down to Ecuador. How was that experience for you?
Well, I loved having you guys there. It was a wonderful group, and everyone survived. No one got any bites or any major issues. So it was really fun. And I felt like we had deep bonding and a lot of great conversations.
Yeah, it was a very potent gathering. You are a legend in this space, in this field. I think many people watching this will be familiar with your work, but for those who are not, maybe just take a step back and share a bit about your background and your experiences with the Amazon.
So literally my first day in college, I was 17, and I had immigrated from Iran to Akron, Ohio during the revolution. And first week in college, I received a pamphlet about the Gaia hypothesis. And it was one of those aha moments that truly, awakened me at a cellular level. I realized this whole philosophy of the earth as a theory, as earth as a living system, as an organism that is, has collective intelligence, that is alive. And that realization, I felt that brought me to this realization that I am a cell in the body of a living earth, and that I have an opportunity to be in service to a host. That was a real profound moment at a young age. It was a formative moment. I also met a really close friend of mine who was working as a biologist, studying to be a biologist, and she had Peruvian descent. And so she told me about the Amazon, and that was the other thing that really, ignited my imagination about the rainforest as, organs of the biosphere. And I went on this 8-year quest where I tried to read everything I could and started having recurring dreams about the rainforest. And in these dreams, I would often be in circles around a fire or flying over the forest, seeing vast areas of the forest. And it's like I had tuned into the radio dial of the signals from the Amazon. And it was a bit of an obsession. I like couldn't get it out of my mind. And so, and of course, I didn't have any clue how I could have an impact or an influence. I just felt called. And at the time, I was finishing college. I eventually began my first job in the city of Santa Monica doing conservation work for the city, doing water and energy conservation work. But I couldn't get the Amazon out of my mind. And one day, a really wonderful mentor and friend from the water conservation world came to me and said, we're having a meeting in the Bay Area. He said, get in the car. Please get in the car. We have a few hours free. I want to take you somewhere. And I said, where are you taking me? He's like, just get in the car. And he drove me to the headquarters of the Rainforest Action Network. He pulled in front of the office and opened the door and said, we appreciate you very much and all the work you're doing on water conservation, but we're really tired of you talking about the rainforest. We're actually sick and tired of you talking about the rainforest. So I got you an appointment with the executive director of Rainforest Action Network. I want you to go in there and tell them that you can't stop talking about the rainforest. And so I did. I went to meet Rainforest Action Network's director and founder, Randy Hayes, and he literally put me to work. He's like, well, as a volunteer initially, and then as a campaigner, and I worked for the Rainforest Action Network in the trenches doing campaigns to protect rainforests for about 5 or 6 years. And then
what years were those?
Those were from 1990 to 1996. And initially as a volunteer and eventually as a campaigner. And it was an incredible experience. I learned so much about the rainforest. But then the calling began again. I started around 95 getting the call from the Amazon and it started coming into my consciousness again. And at the time, there was a lot of fear about a massive plan to basically create export corridors throughout the Amazon. And I was very worried about what would to come with this, multi-billion-dollar package to build roads and pipelines and dams and oil drilling and basically export corridor to export resources from the heart of the rainforest to global markets. And it was a plan that a lot of multilateral banks were, behind. And I just felt like it needed to be exposed. I did a series of strategy meetings and conversations, and it looked like nobody had the resources or the time to work on it. And I felt like I needed to do something. So, literally, I started, feeling like I need to take the next leap. And I gave my notice. I wasn't sure what I was going to do. And then there was literally a moment where I got an invitation that the president of Brazil, who was promoting this plan and raising money for this plan, was speaking at Stanford Monday morning. This was on a Saturday. And I was like, we've got to do something. And there was really no one around. The campaigners were out of town. I'd already given my notice. There was no one to really do anything. So I just showed up Monday morning with a bullhorn and confronted the president of Brazil on his way out of the auditorium. I just stood up on a ledge and I confronted him, and it was election year. So he had flown to the Bay Area with a jet full of Brazilian media, plus all the Bay Area media. So there was like literally a bank of 30 or 40 cameras. And I got up out there, and as he was walking by, he stopped in front of me and just looked at me for about 3 seconds. And the media got the shot of us face to face with me with the bullhorn. And then he got in his limousine and he left. And there was all this press going, what is this about? And all I literally had time to do was make copies of a Time magazine article about this plan for the Amazon. So I just handed out the plan. I said, this is what he's up to. He's getting an award at Stanford. but really this is what he's doing to the Amazon. And one of the journalists said, so what is your name and what's your organization? And I said, I'm Atossa Soltani. I'm with, and at that moment I realized I couldn't say Rainforest Action Network because I didn't even have any support from them or any, so I said Amazon Watch. I made it up on the spot.
Amazon Watch.
Amazon Watch. And so the next day, that was all over the media. Like Atossa Soltani of Amazon Watch confronts the president of Brazil.
Wow.
And so I got a call from one of the founders of Rainforest Action Network. I thought I was in trouble. And he's a legend. His name's Mike Roselle. And he said, so I heard what you did. And I was like, yeah, I know. Well, there wasn't time and I just felt like compelled. And it was very spontaneous. He's like, all right, well, I'm going to help you start Amazon Watch. And so he basically gave me my first $1,000 and a little bit of help incorporating Amazon Watch. And thereafter, I was off. And that was 26 years ago. Now Amazon Watch has 35 staff members in every Amazon country. We're, headquartered in Oakland. We have an amazing team and board. And I continue to serve the organization as the president. I was the ED for 18 years. And then I, again, got the call that I needed to go and spend time in the forest. And, being an executive director was amazing, but it also didn't give me much time to think and reflect and strategize and be on the ground with the people. So I started doing these journeys with Bill and Lynn Twist and also folks from the indigenous movement in Ecuador and Peru who I'd worked with for decades. And we took the time in 2016 and 17 to really reflect on what needed to emerge next, what needed to happen. Amazon Watch is doing great work, stopping oil projects, stopping pipelines, mines, supporting indigenous rights, and continues targeting investors, getting them to divest from destructive projects. That was really growing work. And I felt like there was something else that needed to emerge, and that was the solutions. So here's what we're against, but what is it we're for? And it needed to be an indigenous people's own visions and their own, vision about what needed to emerge. What was their vision for the next 20 or 30 years? We weren't necessarily going to protect huge tracts of the Amazon fighting one battle in one place, one pipeline, one oil well at a time. We really needed to unite and create a more, zoom out a little bit and have a bigger vision of what needed to happen. So in those conversations with the indigenous peoples who had been long-term collaborators and leaders of this region, the vision emerged for the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Initiative, which is basically a vision to permanently protect the headwaters rainforest in Ecuador and northern Peru, an area the size of the state of Oregon, where indigenous peoples are primarily, have land rights and are, doing a great job holding back the tide of destructive development. But it's an area that's pretty much threatened. 80% of it is threatened with future oil and mining and roads and dams and pipelines, and also areas that have already been degraded that need healing. And so this vision emerged that we unite in an alliance at the level of the watersheds of the Napo and the Pastaza and the Marañón, and that we create a vision for permanent protection that really is based on indigenous stewardship, indigenous governance, and an ecological transition that really transitions away from the extractive mindset, the extractive economy of drilling and mining, and goes into a regenerative standing forest economy that's based on well-being, the well-being of the people, the well-being of the forest, the well-being of all life. And so that vision emerged. And so we've been working on that for the last 6 years. In the process, we created basically a blueprint, a bioregional plan, a plan for the permanent protection of the forests that really is, I think one of the most holistic and comprehensive efforts to date to basically put indigenous cosmology of buen vivir, or well-being, at the core of this idea of ecological transition. And it, it's visionary, it's ambitious, it's holistic, and it's very inspiring. So now we're moved from visioning and dreaming to implementing this plan, and it's going to take a ton of resources and expertise and collaboration at a level we've never seen before. Sort of radical collaboration, multi-stakeholder processes, basically doing that while we still fight to protect, to put out the fires, to protect areas that are threatened urgently. So that's where I'm working in now.
And we're going to put links in the show notes. And for those who are listening to this, we're also going to be overlaying this video with graphics if people want to check out the visuals. There's so much to unpack here. Starting with that bioregional plan, what I find really interesting is also the methodology in which you developed it. Can you share more about how this plan came to be?
Well, it started with Indigenous people's own vision for that of permanent protection, that in 7 generations, they still want to see the forest thriving, cultures thriving, animals, in a high state of conservation, that people are living well in healthy, empowered, just, setting, in a context of land rights, in the context of nature has rights, in the context that there is, equity and justice, in a context that, there is people have spent the last 30 or 40 years fighting the road, fighting the mine, fighting the oil drilling, fighting, and there's this feeling like we're ready to build the next thing. We're ready for the world to see this area of the Amazon, which is basically the most biodiverse rainforest. Has had the highest registered rates of biodiversity, and it has, a history of being an ecological refuge during the last ice age. This area didn't freeze over. Some of the, folds of the Andes into the lowland rainforest were able to harbor life while the continent was frozen and repropagate life once the ice receded. It was a refugia. It's called the Pleistocene Refuge. It was a refugia for life to return to the continent. This area was significant and also has, to give you an idea, in one area the size of a football field of forest in this part of the Amazon, there are more species of trees than in all of US and Canada combined. It's just astonishing biodiversity.
One football field of forest, more species of trees than all of the United States and Canada combined.
Exactly.
Wow.
So it is definitely, highly biodiverse. It also has high rates of endemism. That means there are, in 1 hectare of forest, there might be countless species that only live in that area or surrounding few hectares, and nowhere else. So there's also, with every acre of forest that's destroyed, we lose species we never even documented, we never even identified. In fact, some estimates say less than 5% of the plant species of the Amazon have been, identified and categorized. So we are, countless of them are important for medicines, for, are incredibly important for healing, for, and also have rights to exist as intrinsic rights. My own connection to this forest came from also just understanding the ecological functions that the rainforests play and the biosphere. So back to the process. So how was the process? So the process was, wisdom keepers from Indigenous nations talked a lot about what is core, what is central to their philosophy of life, which is harmony. The concept of buen vivir is collective harmony. Harmony within a community, within relationship of a community and the nearby forest, the forest with the nearby bioregion, and with the world. And so it's this relational harmony. And so from that perspective of, we want to have in 7 generations thriving forests in harmony. And that development was basically this word that had been imposed around the world to basically didn't connote some kind of progress from no development to development. And this linear idea of progress had really been the conquest of nature, being a conquest and of it cultures, it had been colonization, genocide. That was the impact of this word development, with the idea that there was something beyond development. There's a lot of discourse in Latin America that comes from indigenous cosmology of a word it's a Quechua word that's called Sacha, which is living forest. The forest is alive. The earth is alive. The paradigm that the forest is alive. And then within the living forest, there's summa causa, which is this idea of living in harmony with a living forest. And so from those, and I'm simplifying it, this is, has very deep meaning of, that involves basically the perpetuation and regeneration of life. Nature is your mother. You are in relationship to all life. And this idea of kinship with all life. Everything is your family. Everything. The mountain is alive. The forest is alive. The animals are your relatives. The earth is your mother. And you are walking on the footsteps. Your footsteps are on the faces of the unborn generations. This cosmology is, essential to many indigenous peoples around the world. And in particular, in this part of the Amazon, they were very much present every day in every conversation. Is a conversation about Buen Vivir and Sumak Kazai and Kazak Sacha and these ideas of, we've all heard it before. We've all heard it that we are here in service to future generations, and that we are in reciprocity to Mother Earth. But these folks it's not just an intellectual concept. They live it every day. They truly believe that the forest is alive, their ancestors are present, that they are guardians of life. And so from that place, the plan really tried to make those concepts central to living in harmony. And the other part was that we brought together some of the leading experts around the world around ecological transition, post-capitalist, post-extractive economies, ecological economics, the idea of focusing on well-being instead of economic growth, focusing on well-being indicators and happiness and health and harmony as opposed to GDP. All those concepts, we brought some of the folks like Jason Hickel and Charles Eisenstein, and we borrowed from donut economics and looked at the work of transformational work of economists who are looking at alternative systems of governance, alternative systems of exchange, and so we incorporated much of that into the bioregional plan, and it was kind of modeled after. It was holistic because indigenous people said, we don't create silos. When we develop our plans for our territories, we call them life plans. And a life plan is this holistic plan that includes everything from the health of the forest, the health of the community, the cultural vibrance, identity and cultural practices, traditional knowledge, and the economy and livelihoods in service to those goals. And so it really puts the spiritual and the ecological at the center of a plan, which includes the economy, and as opposed to our world where the economy is sort of seen as the principal goal and everything else is in service to the economy. Here, everything is in service to life. So we borrowed from indigenous people's life plans, and we actually gathered a lot of the life plans and used them as the basis for creating the bioregional plan. And there was a lot of assemblies and meetings and a lot of process because Even though it was COVID and it was hard to have in-person meetings as much as we would have liked, we needed to slow down and really listen. And so the plan is a reflection of 5 years of that process. And of course, it's just the beginning. And it's seen as a living document that continues to be fed through the processes that we are in now. And now the Alliance is in a space where we are looking to, collaborate with other organizations that are active in this landscape. And one of the other things that Indigenous people said is that we don't just want to plan for the Indigenous nations, which are 30 Indigenous nations in this landscape, around 700,000 people. We don't just want to plan for our well-being. We need to have a plan for everyone's well-being who's in this landscape, which include another 2.3 million people who live in towns and who are not Indigenous, who are more settlers, and that, Indigenous people see them as important as themselves. And then ultimately, their aspiration is that this plan serves the world as a model, and that this forest serves the world, as the Amazon is a vital organ of the biosphere. And so, so that's where we are.
It's beautiful. I mean, there's so many projects that talk about like maybe one day we'll be a model, but I feel like you're really living it. I feel like when I read that bioregional plan, like I can't unsee it, and it's just like a lens and many different lenses that is embodied in a way that it feels so replicable and relevant to communities all around the world, and just the thoughtfulness and the approach and the listening and the not just the 5 years spent developing the plan, but the thousands of years of wisdom that are really embodied in its essence. You talked a bit about the biodiversity of the Amazon, and it's like when you talk about progress, I'm just thinking like what could be, nature has given us a living understanding of what progress looks like in terms of the complexity of life, the thriving interrelationships of a dynamic, mature, old growth rainforest ecosystem. And yet here we somehow think the progress is cutting it down to put pipes or mines or whatever in it. But I'm wondering if you can share more about how you see the importance of the Amazon, and for people who maybe just hear, okay, it's a big forest somewhere down there in South America, but don't necessarily have an appreciation for how vital the Amazon is for the entire biosphere.
Yeah, so let's zooming out. The planet has a ring around the equator of tropical rainforests. So when you look at Earth from space, you will see that the tropical rainforests occur in a 3,000-mile wide band that is all around the equator, and there they are basically stabilizing the planet's hydrological system and weather. The Amazon in particular, so historically we've lost 50% of the world's tropical rainforests. And it's very, very destabilizing to our climate. We see climate change as all this carbon in the atmosphere, but what we don't realize is we've also lost the biosphere's own resilient system for controlling and regulating the climate. Of the rainforests that remain, the Amazon rainforest is the largest, and the Amazon rainforest is the size of the continental United States. To give you a sense of what that is, it's like the surface of the moon, size of the surface of the moon.
Wow.
And when you think about the way that the Amazon River flows, the Amazon River is the largest river on Earth, and at its mouth, it discharges into the Atlantic something like 209,000 cubic meters per second. That's a big number. If you add the next 6 largest rivers on the planet, and combine their flow, you only just get to the flow of the Amazon River. So that's a massive hydrological system. But the amount of water vapor that the rainforest evapotranspire into the sky every day is a river 20% bigger than the Amazon River. So the Amazon rainforest, in addition to being housing the largest river system in the world, is literally putting up a river in the sky 20% bigger than the Amazon River every day through evapotranspiration. When trees are photosynthesizing, they're opening their pores, and water molecules are basically evaporating and transpiring. They're sweating out water vapor, and that is basically it's like geysers. Each tree, on average, is able to lift 1,000 liters of water per day into the sky.
Wow.
When you have 400 billion trees in the Amazon, you have basically flying rivers, atmospheric rivers that rise every day from the forest, that basically bring rain deeper and deeper into the continent of South America. But then when they hit the Andes, those atmospheric rivers go north and south, and some of those atmospheric rivers bring rain to North America, to Mexico, to US Southwest, all the way in the Sierra Nevada. There are some modeling that shows that rainfall patterns in the Amazon affect moisture content in California, in the Sierra Nevada mountain range. So the Amazon has been always called the lungs of the earth. And it is true, because in the way that the Amazon absorbs CO2, the trees absorb CO2 and breathe out oxygen. So that's kind of like our own lungs. But more and more indigenous peoples always said the Amazon is the heart of the planet, heart of the Mother Earth. And now through meteorological and scientific analysis, we're basically concurring that the Amazon basically operates as the heart of the hydrological climatic system of the biosphere. It is actually big enough to be an entity, an organ in the biosphere. So it's both the heart and the lungs of the biosphere. And basically, moisture is in the atmosphere, the water vapor is in the atmosphere. The circulation system that brings that moisture into the Atlantic, the Amazon literally beckons that moisture. And the fragrance from aerosol particles from fragrant trees, from flowering trees, nucleate the clouds, and the bacteria and the biota nucleate the clouds, allowing it to rain. And then the basically the trees lift back up, and in doing so, they release heat into the upper atmosphere. They actually cool the planet. The cloud cover over the Amazon is creating a cooler environment by reflecting light, but also releasing heat above, into the upper atmosphere, and so expelling it out into space. So the Amazon's literally the air conditioning of the planet. It's also the rain machine in the way it's, circulating, generating rain, and also driving rain to other parts of the world. So all of that system is, in part mostly dependent on the trees. The trees are doing the heavy lifting. And once there's, the research, I'm part of something called the United Nations Science Panel on the Amazon. And it was basically an effort to bring together 200 scientists and experts in a process that took 2 or 3 years to issue the most definitive assessment of the state of the Amazon and where we're at. And the conclusions are pretty alarming. And one of those is that between the amount of rainforest that's already been degraded or completely deforested, we've lost around 26% of the Amazon's original forest cover. And that we also have, scientists have also done studies to show that, at some point, when the forest loses between 20 and 25% of its forest cover, the trees no longer lift up sufficient rain through the evapotranspiration in order to basically cycle and generate the atmospheric rivers and the hydrological system. And so there's a tipping point after which the forest begins to lose its capacity to generate enough rain to be a rainforest, and begins to tip into a process of savannahization, becoming a savanna. Now, that could take 50 to 70 years for rainforest to go from being a rainforest to a savanna. But the tipping point at which that happens is, now, basically, in the next 3 to 5 to 10 years at most. And in parts of the Amazon rainforest in southern Brazil, where there's been massive deforestation due to cattle ranching and agriculture, it's already tipped. We've already seen shifts in rainfall patterns in those areas. And so Amazon biome as a system, as this vital organ, its ecological integrity is on the line. We basically have somewhere between 1 to 5 years in order to prevent the irreversible tipping point. It might take 70 years to experience the massive dieback of the Amazon, but the tipping point is now. That's why it's so urgent that every tree, every forest, every acre of rainforest that's now destroyed is basically pushing us to an irreversible tipping point. And what the calculus shows, what the metrics show, is that we have to protect 80% of the Amazon forest cover by 2025. And that is way above what the Montreal Biodiversity Framework is calling for, which is 30% of the earth and 30% of ecoregions and ecosystems need to be protected by 2030. Sure, for biodiversity, maybe that is a metric that's needed, but in terms of maintaining the ecological integrity of the hydroclimatic system of the biosphere, we need actually to be 80%. And we've already lost 26%. So that means we have to get to zero deforestation by 2025 and actually start a massive reforestation effort to reforest 6% of the Amazon, which is no small task. Right. It's a massive effort. It's doable, though. And then we must do it because the Amazon is the largest carbon sink on the planet.
Right.
And losing the Amazon would basically, it's not an option. There is no life possible on planet Earth if we lose the Amazon. So, that's why I'm part of also a coalition of organizations, indigenous organizations and NGOs that are calling for a global treaty to permanently protect 80% of the Amazon by 2025. And this is a critical year, 2023. We now have Lula in office. There's President Petro in Colombia, Lula in Brazil. They're basically coming together to call for a massive summit on the Amazon in August of 2023 in Brazil, where they're calling for world leaders to come and have a significant commitment to the future of the Amazon rainforest. And I think our role as civil society is to make sure that there is, a good, solid agreement that achieves as its goal, protecting the ecological integrity of this entity, this regional entity, this vital organ of the biosphere, that we can't compromise. It has to get to, this idea of ecological integrity. There is a threshold, a scientific threshold that we need to achieve. And the sacred headwaters, in a way, is a small part of the Amazon. It's the headwaters. It's the most biodiverse part of the Amazon. It's also an area where indigenous nations are very strong, but it's not enough. What we're doing there needs to expand to the rest of the Amazon. We actually, as a global community, need to see that the rainforests, this largest collection of life on planet Earth, we could, it's in our own bodies. Like, we could lose an arm or a leg and survive. But if we lose our vital organs, we will not be able to survive. So we actually have to start seeing the Amazon as vital to life, for all life, for the entire planet. And we need to, make a commitment, an urgent commitment. And the other really amazing thing about the Amazon is that, it is a third of the Amazon is indigenous lands. And what we're seeing is that indigenous lands have lower deforestation in the Amazon than even national parks. So indigenous peoples are actually doing a fantastic job of holding back the tide of destruction and protecting their forests. We need to learn from them. And also, even if indigenous people succeed in protecting 30% of the Amazon, it's not enough. Right. The rest of the society needs to also learn and transition. Right. And we know for sure that, there is a way to pair the goal of financial and economic prosperity with flourishing forests, flourishing biodiversity, flourishing, life. And it's just that we just need to shift the way we see and carry our economic activities. Currently, our global economic system is life blind. It doesn't distinguish between a parking lot and an ancient forest. That is the riddle. If there are tech people out there, if people are thinking about the blockchain, or they're thinking about economic models, how do you embed the flourishing of life over time? Embed that in activities that generate financial prosperity. How do we redefine wealth? How do we redefine wealth from, the number of oil barrels a country has, or the assets that it has in terms of the, tons of gold, to, intact forests, to biodiversity, to number of species, to biomass, to biological productivity of the biosphere needs to be the metric that we design economic systems around, not the other way around.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Atossa. I'm feeling it. It's so heavy. I mean, to recognize it's the Amazon rainforest as the largest source of carbon sequestration of land, the most biodiverse ecosystem on our planet, and the most critical organs of the hydrological climate. Would you call it the hydroclimatic cycle? System. I feel like that also, a lot of the conversations I'm a part of, it seems like that's the sequence. People kind of are going from carbon to biodiversity to then water. And the awareness is kind of gradually going in that general direction. And so when you have this ecosystem, this region, these peoples stewarding this place, that it's really the most, every place is important, but it's like without the Amazon, we have nothing, right? Like that's how it's been hitting me is when I got involved in the climate space and kind of through the work, I always kind of felt like it's not really my place. Like, I don't have a connection to this place. I'm not from there. I don't know the language. Like, I'm focused on other places. And so, but now I'm feeling more and more this experience of like, well, it's kind of all of our work. So we have to integrate it and hold it in our approach, in our thinking, in our full examination. And yeah, so Center for Biological Diversity, the Montreal, event that happened recently, the commitment from global leaders to try to protect 30% of Earth by 2030, and you're drawing this kind of comparison that says, well, we can't afford those types of numbers in this region of the world because, one, the tipping point is that 20% forest loss means we go into desertification over the next 50 to 70 years. So really, the aim is have 80% protection by 2025, and it's not like, oh, we're just trying to be more ambitious. It's like, no, this is the 30 by 30 framework is kind of an average across all landscapes, and it's still not nearly ambitious enough given the state of affairs. But the game is on right now in the Amazon. Like, we're talking about a really critical moment, a really critical tipping point, in few years of our responsibility on this planet. Are we trending towards deforestation right now? Are we trending towards net reforestation? Like, in this moment in 2023, where are we at in terms of how much loss versus gain are we having in the forest cover?
Well, the last 5 years, since Bolsonaro was elected in 2019 until this year, 2023, when Lula took office, we were in a basically downward spiral in terms of rising deforestation. Forest fires in 2019 were really what pushed the UN to do the science panel. I mean, we were in critical state. We were losing, we were 30% higher deforestation rates, we're experiencing over the last 5 years. We'll see what happens now. I mean, now is the Lula just took office. He's appointed a number of really brilliant environmentalists like Marina Silva, and also indigenous leaders like Sonia Guajajara, who was a leader of the National Indigenous Organization of Brazil. Now she's the Minister of Indigenous Affairs. So a number of people are in office now that can giving us a lot of hope, but it's going to take, significant coordination. Right now in Peruvian Amazon, things are going back wrong. There is a rising deforestation. There's the government's in chaos. The Congress is looking at rolling back indigenous rights. There's a huge land grab by agriculture, by mining. Illegal mining is now affecting, in all 9 countries of the Amazon, something like 11% of the Amazon basin is being affected by legal and illegal mining. So it is an emergency. One of the things that the chapters I worked on in the science panel was around the solutions. Where do we go from here? And the first thing we need is a declaration of an emergency, because we are way behind and way under-resourced to enforce even existing laws to stop deforestation. And literally in Glasgow, 140 plus countries committed to zero deforestation by 2030, which is, not even fast enough. But in the Amazon, we're nowhere near getting to zero deforestation in this moment. So whether it's 2025 or 30, we need to get to zero deforestation. And that requires huge amounts of enforcement, monitoring, but also policies to, it's often put, the burden's often put on either the people who live in the forest or even the private sector, but the governments have a huge burden here. They're green lighting. Like right now, the Ecuadorian government's looking at 80,000 mining concession requests for environmental licenses. So they have to basically, the governments have to have coherent public policies. They can't be saying, oh, we want to, provide incentives to farmers while they're authorizing, new mines or new roads or new. But ultimately, these governments, we have to also recognize that majority of the Amazonian governments are in financial straitjackets.
Exactly.
They have financial systems where they depend on borrowing from international institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. Often they're mortgaging the Amazon in order to borrow money. They're using their potential oil reserves and the potential timber stands and their potential gold mines to borrow this money, and then having to drill and pillage in order just to serve the interest on their external debt. So we really when you look at the GDP of the 9 Amazon countries and you look at their GDP to debt ratio, all of them are about between 60 and 100%. of their, GDP, of their, GDP to debt ratio. So in the Amazon, in Ecuador, for example, if you look at how much the revenues come from oil drilling, they're roughly about the same as the amount of money the government pays to service their external debt. So we have to have debt relief as a major part of any policy to protect the Amazon. And right now, debt relief globally has been a topic, but only for poor countries from a poverty perspective, not from a biodiversity or climate perspective. So we need to change the mindset of these multilateral banks and all banks, private banks, bilateral institutions, to say, look, there are mega biodiverse countries who need debt relief in exchange for their commitments to protect forests and biodiversity. We've got to use that as a tool. We also have to shift the financial system so that they're not going to continue to go into debt the next 10 years. Often these countries borrow money and pay interest on the debt, and they never pay back the principal. They never get from, and sometimes they'll pay 10 to 20 times what they borrowed. The principal that they borrowed. It's unfair, it's unjust, and we are basically saying, we need to take a holistic look at how countries in the tropical rainforest belt around the world, whether it's the Congo or Indonesia or the Brazilian Amazon or Peru, how do we incentivize the protection of life in the tropical rainforest, especially because that's where most of the Earth's biodiversity is, in order to create financial incentives and financial systems that are life-seeing. And where if you have biodiversity, you get zero interest loans and you get financial remuneration because those forests are providing an ecological function for the whole planet. Not just it shouldn't just be up to Ecuador to figure out how to pay for protecting its forests.
Right.
So as a global community, we need, and the other thing we need to do, which is happening right now, is accelerate these deforestation laws. The European Union just passed deforestation-free commodities law, whereby the EU cannot import any product that comes from deforestation, whether it's timber, gold, or cattle or meat. Basically any party, any third party, any citizen can sue in the European Union to stop the entry of products that contribute to deforestation. And importers have to certify that their product is not contributing to deforestation. That just came to effect this month. And that's significant. We need those in China. We need them in the US. We need those laws in all the major markets in the world. We need, basically technical know-how and real-time monitoring so that we have good feedback loops and can respond to deforestation fronts. And we also need to educate people in every walk of life so that they connect to this understanding that they are a cell in a body of Gaia, and that they're responsible to a host, to keeping the host alive, and that the key to keeping themselves and their children well and healthy into the future is keeping them. It's planetary health. It's got to be our mantra, not economic growth, but planetary health.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we're all so complicit in this high degree of consumption demand that is also providing the ongoing pressures and, yes, revenue, but it's like we wouldn't have this degree of destruction of forests, of clearing for cattle, of all the palm oil, like without the demand function of the consumer. And countries like the one I'm from, the United States, have put a far more disproportionate pressure of consumption into these areas, and we need to take responsibility for that. And yeah, I mean, it's so unjust to think that people who are trying to pay back debt to foreign countries, often in currencies they don't control. US dollar has a lot of prominence in these systems. Certainly it did, in our conversations in Ecuador, that can barely keep up with just the interest payments on the debt, living at substandard livelihoods compared to those countries that they're paying the money back to. And that is, of course, only going to result in the destruction of and commodification of nature, because those are the resources and assets available, is the oil, are the rare earth minerals, and once again, mostly then being exported back to those same places. Like it's insane. Like, I mean, it's really insane. So you've offered some solutions or the contours of some solutions to talk about debt relief. There's debt swaps for nature, which is a topic that's becoming more commonly discussed, where the idea that debt can be forgiven in exchange for the ongoing protection of these biological spaces. You spoke about kind of a declaration of emergency and just making sure that that we're sounding the alarm, and that we have a global sense of awareness at all levels of institutions, governments, and everyone, households and families, to understand the degree of urgency here. You spoke about not purchasing, consuming products and rules that can help facilitate that are sourced from the deforestation or destruction of forests and the Amazon. Would love to understand this carbon markets, like this idea of carbon credits as like a potential tool to value the sequestration of carbon, and to offset the footprint of other destructive activities. How are you seeing that show up in the communities that you're engaged with? And maybe we can talk a bit more about the challenges there.
Yeah, well, it's the whole idea that we need to incentivize forest protection and create disincentives for forest destruction, is generally a good idea to look for incentives to say, tax this and, reward this. What we want to be careful, though, is that currently, well, first of all, make sure that we're incentivizing and disincentivizing in a way that it doesn't have perverse consequences. Mm-hmm. And that also that be careful, because in a capitalistic market, in a capitalistic system, we basically have to be careful that the commons, which are indigenous lands, which is majority of the land in the Amazon, don't just become a private asset on someone's balance sheet, right, that then become owned by a set of private investors or capital holders. Basically, the worry I have is, someone close to us said once, be careful of the eyes of Mordor, seeing the commons of the Amazon and wanting to, mm-hmm. Become visible to the market. And when the market sees something that can allow it to basically make an asset out of something that's previously the commons, it can actually be detrimental over time. What we really need to do is, yes, we need to find structures and incentives that do that, but that support maintaining these forests. These forests have rights. These forests are mm-hmm. not just commodities. They instead of making oil a commodity, now we're going to make carbon a commodity. And so we have to be a little bit critical of how we might be imposing solutions from the same mindset, right, that created the problem, right, which is that basically the commons need to be stewarded and governed for the benefit of all, and not just used as, assets in private ownership to make money for a few. And so, that would be my criticism. In a lot of the places where I work in the sacred headwaters, deforestation rates are super low. They're almost 0.1 or less. Mm. And indigenous peoples are doing a great job of protecting these large tracts of forests. But the market would say, well, those areas aren't eligible to receive benefits from like REDD+ mechanisms because they can't demonstrate a baseline of deforestation that they're reducing. So there's no money there. So there's no way to reward stewards for doing a great job of protecting the forest because they have traditionally had success protecting forests. But that metric, that modality, that methodology doesn't factor in the new roads that are coming, the new mines that they're proposed, the new oil drilling that's coming, that is just slowly going. And it's not past, it's not a historic threat, it's a future threat. And we're not really totally able to say, how do you take a future threat and create incentives to prevent future threats?
Because carbon credits basically work with the premise that you start with some sort of baseline of what would deforestation be in the absence of some new behavior. And then that new behavior is compensated, and that it needs to prove some sort of additional carbon sequestration.
Exactly.
And the problem is if you have an intact forest that has a baseline of not being deforested because the people have been sacrificing economic development in exchange for maintaining ecological wealth, that they cannot have that, real baseline established. Plus, they can't really prove that there's any additional carbon sequestration through their stewardship and through conservation. So there's no payments there.
That's right.
There's no compensation there. It's a broad generalization. Whereas if you have an empty lot and someone comes in, maybe with a more capitalist mindset, this is great. I'm going to plant rows and rows and rows of this one type of tree, and it's going to sequester carbon. Well, voila, you have additionality, you have carbon sequestration that's easy and tidy to measure. Great, they're the ones that get the paycheck. And so we give them the check rather than the people who are stewarding the most biodiverse, carbon sequestering, hydrologically important lands on the planet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and the other piece of this is that if we really wanted to change the behavior of who's destroying the forest, we'd have to change the behavior of the government. They're the ones who are planning the road or planning the green lighting the pipeline or concessioning the mine or concession. If it was me, we're trying, okay, we need to provide incentives to reduce deforestation and say, look at the government's economic plan, figure out what's going to be the deforestation impacts of that, and figure out how to pay the governments off not to do that plan.
Right.
But not just pay them off, require them to follow the laws, require them to respect rights, fight them, to pressure them to do the right thing, but also give them incentives, because ultimately, like I said, most of those decisions are justified, even though there's a lot of corruption and the economic elite in these countries, basically has a lot of power to influence decisions, even if they violate laws. So we do have those kinds of things, just like in the United States, the oil lobby has prevented climate action for decades, right? And the oil lobbyists in climate negotiations have prevented the words fossil fuels to be in climate agreements, so same kind of things happening in countries like Peru and Ecuador and Brazil, where economic interests are hijacking the public interest. And but we do want to, let's say that we do want to acknowledge that these governments are succumbing to the economic interests because they are also straitjacketed by their financial systems like debt. So, I would say let's do an analysis. What are all of the oil wells and new mines, pipelines and roads and dams and agriculture that the government has in its plans, the plans it submits to the IMF, the plans it submits to its own economic strategy. Let's calculate the potential deforestation from those, and then see how we incentivize the government not to do those things and commit legally and financially to not do those things, and reward the governments for having a different kind of economic strategy.
Right.
But also, I think finding a way to reward indigenous peoples, whether in a way, the other thing I worry about if directly rewarding communities for doing the right thing is sometimes I worry if that erodes intrinsic value.
Totally.
These indigenous nations see this landscape as sacred. That's why the Sacred Headwaters Initiative has the word sacred, because it's above money. They are willing to die protecting their forests for their children and for future generations of all life. So I worry paying them to do that. Does that erode their intrinsic value of being forest guardians? But they do have basic needs. When their children are, reach sixth grade, most of them have to be shipped off to the local town to go to high school. They want to get a high school education. That costs money. If they want to, even in their communities, when they have children in K through 6, they have to provide as much as $100 to $200 a year for school supplies and fund their own school. And that's a lot of money for communities that live subsistently outside of the money economy. When there's a snake, someone's bit by a snake and needs emergency evacuation, or woman is in labor having complications and needs to be evacuated to a hospital in these roadless rainforests, which are days and days and days away from the nearest hospital. They need to be airlifted out or, flown out. That costs money. That might cost $500-$600 for someone to be taken to definitive care. And so, we discuss this a lot in the Sacred Headwaters, that indigenous and local communities who are stewarding forests have a right to basic services. And, some people call it universal basic income or universal basic services. If you had free education, free transportation, emergency evacuation, those rights, if those were the things that were funded in order for communities to continue to live in harmony with their forest, I think that it might have an impact of like basically preventing the oil companies or the logging companies from coming to the community and saying, we'll give you $100,000 tomorrow if you can log your forest. I think those communities would stand stronger against those kinds of temptations if they had universal basic services, if they had universal basic income, collectively able to have, the basic needs met.
Yeah. I think for those with more of a funding lens or business lens, I would say like it's pretty remarkable still how far dollar for dollar the value stretches in these places. Like I think we can do a lot. Every dollar makes a huge contribution. I mean, I remember with one of the villages that you took us to, and we were exchanging some cash, giving basically tips, and for the people who had looked after us for a number of days. And one of the village folks remarked, they made a joke about, because there was $100 bill in circulation somewhere, and they were like, what can I do with $100 bill?
Yeah.
Like, there's no local bank teller. Like, we need ones and fives. Like,
right.
What can I do with $100 bill? Like, I mean, that's the level of exchange that's happening. And it's just all the more heartbreaking that, these communities in the Sacred Headwaters are asking for like basic medical services, because as every human does, like if a child needs medical attention, or if a mother is giving birth and having a problem, like it's like, okay, do we need a road? Do we need a hospital? Do we need carbon credits? Like what do we need to make that happen? What do I need to give my child education? Like, this is not to buy fancy cars and to consume lavishly or whatever. I mean, these are basic human services and needs that are coming into contact with the global financial system, and that just needs reconciled in all of its complexity. I think if there's a few things that keep coming up for me, for folks listening. Like, one is just like, the time is urgent. Amazon is crucially important. We just need to understand that message, as a start. The second is just like, this is enormously complex. I only grasp a small, tiny tidbit of what you understand, but it's very clear that these are very complex issues. It's not going to be solved just by one incentive change, one government actor, one business corporation. This is going to require an enormous complexity of responses and changes. And I guess the third is we're all responsible, or we're all complicit at some level. This is our collective endowment, and that we all have a role to play here, that we're all selves within the host. Curious other, reflections, or how you, receive that, and comments.
Yeah, and I would say that even though it feels like daunting and complex, I think there's what inspires me is that there's so much creativity and resilience and commitment everywhere I go in the Amazon. Mm-hmm. There are people who are figuring it out. They're committed. They're resilient. They're creative, and there's it is possible. The possibilities inspire me. Mm-hmm. I think one of the things I'm very hopeful for is that, this frameworks around the rights of nature, which Ecuador started with the constitutional amendment on the rights of nature, and then it's grown from there around the world. The idea of giving nature rights, giving ecosystem rights and personhood, putting ecosystems central to decision making. In Ecuador, there's a ton of work happening in legal actions, but also training judges, developing rules around how nature is protected. And I think we need to really accelerate that. Mm-hmm. That is a transformative change that we need to accelerate. The Amazon has rights, and in Colombia, there are places where that has been recognized in the legal system, mm-hmm. and is having an impact on the ground. We need, I would say one of the things that gives me hope is that, legal frameworks and using the courts and using legal action is significant. It's mm-hmm. very effective. It's a tool that we've used repeatedly, and Indigenous peoples are winning left and right cases in local courts, national courts, international courts in favor of their rights of nature, rights of future generations. They're winning, and they're stopping and dismantling. There have been cases, for example, in a community in Colombia that I work with, where Indigenous peoples filed legal action in a project that was installed, it was actually in production. It was a gas plant. And the courts ruled in favor of the Indigenous people and ordered the company to actually go and dismantle a plant and put it on trucks and haul it away and restore the site. Wow. So we are winning cases every time we fight. So I think one of the, if we can use legal strategies, beef up our legal strategies and our advocacy strategies and our resistance strategies to stop the immediate fires, the immediate destruction, we can buy time. We stop those for 5 or 10 years. Mm-hmm. I have a hard time believing that in 10 years, banks are going to be allowed even to finance new oil drilling or new pipelines or mm-hmm. new infrastructure that lock us into more climate destruction. Yeah. Where that laws aren't going to catch up with the biodiversity implementation of the biodiversity mm-hmm. Montreal framework around how we need to protect basically nature and restore and reduce subsidies and reduce toxins and reduce pollution and pesticides. Those international agreements are being slowly implemented, and legal action can buy us time mm-hmm. while those shifts really have an impact. So I think that's a really important thing. The other is, that we are showing that we can, even through not even, even through traditional calculus, you can show that if you maintain a forest intact, and instead of cutting the forest and extracting and pillaging, they use the fruits, the nuts, the literally the fruits of the forest, mm-hmm. whether they're scientific research or whether it's through incentives like carbon, or whether it's through creating understanding of biomimicry and natural processes through scientific discoveries, we can show that these forests over time can be more financially prosperous for more people than if they were to cut and logged, even through traditional calculus.
Totally.
And so the other thing we really need to do is do true cost and true cost accounting and true cost understanding of the externalities. For example, the mines in Ecuador, which I mentioned, something like 10% of Ecuador is in the process of being green lighted for mining. If you include the cost of remediation, true remediation and restoration into the cost of the profit calculus, these mines would be not financially viable, even by traditional calculations.
Totally.
So we have to use economic and legal policy tools to really stop the destruction. But we also have to really change the narrative around, if the goal was well-being, like New Zealand's doing or Costa Rica's doing, if the goal was happiness, like Bhutan's doing, if the goal was harmony, that more people could live a better quality of life through ecological lens of ecological economics or ecological transition. If we were to look at how much forest needs to be reforested in the Amazon, 6%, and we created an economic and ecological lab of generating knowledge, systems, traditional knowledge in restoration. Ecological restoration could be the economic engine for economic recovery, jobs, and food systems, and and carbon and water. So I would say, we part of it is just we need to create these laboratories for transition and show and tell. And then lastly, I would say, the big focus on carbon is, it's important. We got to not put more carbon into the atmosphere. And the big issue there is to recognize that we need to leave fossil fuels in the ground, undeveloped, untapped fossil fuels in the ground. Countries actually need to be given incentives to not grow the problem. In fact, currently, we've green-lighted enough new fossil fuel extraction, new pipelines, new drilling, new wells, to go over a 3-degree warmer world. And we have not curtailed. We've talked about reducing demand, reducing energy, making energy, green and less carbon intensive, and reducing our consumption. But we haven't restrained production. We're still investing in expanding production. So we really need to curtail production of carbon-intensive infrastructure and things that lock us into more carbon, like industrial agriculture, pesticide production, fossil fuel production. And those are the things that aren't even in the current climate agreements. We had fought really hard to even have the word fossil fuels in the Egypt agreement, but up to the Paris Agreement doesn't have the words fossil fuels in them. So we've got to restrain production. And then I would say, one of my other reflections would be that, yes, it's important to restrain carbon production and see living carbon like forests. But we really, just focusing on carbon, we miss the mark. I've really been, convinced by the data around looking at water. If we reduce, if we slow down the rate of water, the landscape, if we store water in soils, in landscapes, in reservoirs, increase the, water retention of our landscapes, and improve the watersheds that we live in, focus on watersheds, whether it's a tiny watershed in your backyard or the Amazon watershed. That carbon will be the extra bonus that we will get. The reducing emissions from carbon, reducing global warming will be our gift. The water paradigm is is the way to go, is really the thing that we need to make central. And water is a great proxy for life, and carbon is too narrow. And so, like you said earlier, you could cut down a rainforest and plant fast growing trees and make a lot of money on carbon credits and claim that you're sequestering carbon, but you will not have allowed life to flourish there.
Right.
And so water is, I think, the riddle for our civilization to, water is the currency of life, and thinking about how humans help to enhance the hydrological systems around which our lives are dependent, is the riddle of our time, and it should be the focus of our efforts. It should be central to our efforts and it will bring us closer to nature. It'll connect us with protecting forests, restoring wetlands, estuaries, marshes, mangroves, because that's how water flows. And those are the skin and tissue of the Gaia that we can be and make the earth more resilient. And, some of the scientists I've been getting a chance to have exchanges with have written papers that say, we could address climate change in a matter of decades instead of centuries if you focused on water instead of carbon.
Right. Yeah, well, you're going to make the water flow from my eyes, Atossa. It's such a privilege to encounter you and to be on this journey with you. And I just feel like if we can all be so lucky to live a life of such purpose and vigor and leadership the way that you have and continue to do so after now decades of being in this struggle and in this restoration and protection and still I'm just blown away by the vibrancy of how you hold it and carry it and watching you walk in different circles and contexts and moving people to real action and stewardship. It's a real gift. And so how do people support Sacred Headwaters Initiative? Where do people send their funds? Let's make the pitch. And I'll make the pitch for you. Let's all donate and make sure that, our resources can be in service to life. Where do people go and how do they get involved?
Sure. Sacredheadwaters.org is our website, and also on social media. In the Spanish, it's called cuencasagradas.org. And we have a couple of really great, so you can donate. Our fiscal sponsor is the Pachamama Alliance, and also we're in the process of setting up its own nonprofit status as Sacred Headwaters. We have also a wonderful 9-minute film. It's called Amazonia 2041, A Vision from the Future. And it's an animated film that paints the picture of the future that we explain in the bioregional plan. People can watch and share that. That would be a great way. And, we definitely need volunteers and expertise in all of the issues that I mentioned. And funding it's basically 100% of the funds. There's no fees or anything taken out. 100% of funds go to programs in the territories and supporting the Sacred Headwaters Alliance. So we'd be grateful to any kind of support. And remember, I think, the thing we're ultimately all called to is to be in service to Gaia and to recognize it's important to do that locally and connect to globally, because literally, as a body, the earth is calling us all. We can all tune into the radio dial that is the Gaia channel and be in service and listen deeply to what needs to emerge. And I would say the other thing is look at nature as our lesson, as our teacher. Living systems are communities of life, essentially. Nature operates in communities of life that cooperate to create conditions conducive to more life. And so that's a good model for how we move in the world, in communities cooperating in service to basically life flourishing. So
I can hear the birds all chirping as you as you speak that in. Atossa Soltani, thank you so much.
thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Wow, Atossa is such a legend. We're all so lucky to have her. That conversation just really emphasizes to me the urgency of this work. You can learn more at sacredheadwaters.org. You can make a donation on the website and also get involved in many other ways. There's a role for everyone in this movement. You might also be interested in our conversation with Lynn Twist from Pachamama Alliance. You can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com. Please like, share, subscribe. Join our community Discord. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.